There are all kinds of advantages to being the absolutely last panelist, really, to speak at a conference. And to be honest, I can't think what any of those advantages are at this moment in time. I should say that essentially the title that I first provided has changed a little bit. In fact, I am guilty of mission creep, basically. I started out with a particular set of agendas and then basically moved on. And I started out by trying to think a little bit really about the metropolitan context of the IWMA versus regional or provincial context. I then decided I didn't want to do that. I just moved back, of course, to the very famous comment by Marx, really about the O'Brienites, that they were guilty of esoteric sectarianism. That is, that they were, and we've heard these words before, petty bourgeoisie, petty bourgeois and reformist. So I have a whole sequence of titles, really, and I'm a bit dissatisfied with this one, really. So basically, following Groucho Marx, jokes and gags, he famously said, well, if you don't like the gag I've got at the moment, you might like the next few. I'm going to, if you like, of Collins and Abramsky. They've come up a lot, really, during the course of this conference. We're still prisoners a bit of Eric Hobsbawm. We're still talking a little bit as if European socialists, really very ideologically driven, French socialists, German socialists, British radicals and reformers, much more pragmatic. They've got ancient constitutional traditions that are hardwired into them. And things haven't really changed. The historiography has remained very much the same. And I think that's surprising, because any of you who know a little bit about the British historiography relating to 19th century radicalism will know that it's changed a lot in recent years. We had a historiographical earthquake, maybe that's to overstate it, in the middle 1990s, and that included new scholars like Miles Taylor, for example, Eugenio Biagini, a whole sequence of others, who really began to see liberalism as the real drive of political social change, the real vector for change. And a lot of the older radical traditions, particularly in Britain, were marginalised, if you like, and became fairly unimportant, were seen as a residual survival of the 1830s and 1840s. Having said all that, Biagini actually doesn't say a great deal about the IWMA. He does say quite a lot about the Mazzinians, and I think what he says about the Mazzinians needed to be said. The Mazzinians had always been seen as part of a conspiratorial tradition. He reclaims them within British radicalism, and I think that's right, that needed to be done. But he doesn't say a lot, really, about the IWMA per se. Margot Finn's the other big personality here. She did talk about international affairs and international issues in relation to British radicalism, but her view really was that if you like, international issues around the unification of Italy, the rising in Poland, the American Civil War, were all things that actually brought middle-class radicals and older traditions of working-class radicalism together around a kind of liberal nationalism, if you like. She's not so bothered about the Paris Commune. She overlooks all that. Okay, there was a little local difficulty about the Paris Commune, but everybody gets over it. And basically, these big international issues become a solvent of popular liberalism towards the end of the 1870s, 1880s. So we had a historiographical earthquake. It didn't change a great deal insofar as the IWMA is concerned. Looking at the American side of things, as we've already heard, of course, we have quite an interesting situation. We have Messer Cruz, which is a fascinating book dating from the later 1990s, and very polemical, actually, and quite interesting for me as a non-Americanist. And what Messer Cruz essentially tries to do is to disparage, really, the Marxist tradition in the United States, seeing it as something that was very much part of a migrant, emigrant tradition, a German tradition, doctrinaire, Germanic socialism. It became sidelined. It ended up in a cul-de-sac. And what it ends up doing is feeding through, if you like, in his terms, not necessarily in ours, what it ends up doing is feeding through into a tradition that is marginalised. And because it's marginalised, it contributes to a debate I'm sure nobody here wants to have, and that is, of course, why is there no Labour Party in the United States? So he manages to connect all that up as well. He also says that, in a sense, the Marxist tradition, the Friedrich Sorgite tradition, feeds through really into people like Gompers, and they really end up taking a very trade union-orientated, exclusionary position in regard to women in the workplace, migrant groups, people from outside America, a nativist tradition, if you like. So he lays a lot of blame at the doorstep of the First International. So I think the comparison is worth making. It's an interesting one, actually. I don't claim to be a great Americanist, but it is an interesting tradition for what an interesting debate to have about, for what it tells us about the historiography, more than anything else, I think. I should say as well that this is really a much briefer version of what I intended to be a big global project. And like all big global projects, it of course collapsed at the first hurdle. But what I actually wanted to do was compare the IWMA in Britain with the IWMA in the Anglophone world. Now that fell apart immediately because there were no IWMA branches at all in New Zealand. And I'm doubtful about the existence of IWMA branches in Canada, and there was only one in the Australian colonies, and it was a glorified co-op. So essentially we are forced back upon the, if you like, the British United States comparison, I think. We don't really have comparators in the broader empire. And I may come back to that because I think that is quite an interesting idea. So what about really the points I want to make about the international? Well, I think a lot of my interest in the international comes from where it is situated within broader traditions, dare I say, currents of radicalism in Britain and elsewhere. And the fact is, if you look at really the international in its later stages, then you do find out quite a lot about the way in which the international functioned in its decay, if you like, in its senescence, in the days when it was declining. So I want to try and reclaim that, because I think there is much more to be said about that. I also want to say a bit more about radical communities, for the simple reason that there has been a tendency, and it's not unique to this conference, it happens everywhere, to in a sense, talk about the IWMA in regard to trade unions, trade societies, trade organisations, international or otherwise. I think actually the IWMA has a lot more to tell us about other aspects of radicalism than just that. So what I want to do is try and talk about those other traditions and talk maybe about a shadow international. I now realise that should have been my title, actually. Esoteric Sectarianism, the Shadow International. And these are the elements of the international that weren't regarded as acceptable, if you like, to the Marxist tradition. Now, I just want to elaborate very slightly on that, of course. And I still think the best comment on 19th century radicalism, both in Britain and abroad, wasn't made about 19th century radicalism, it was made about Maoism. And I'm sure none of us want to go there, to be brutally frank. But the famous comment on Maoism is that it was a collection of isms. And to be frank, when someone like McCrae, who was the secretary of the American Labour Federation in the 1890s, said that we're all ites now, you can see exactly where he was coming from, Owenites, Bellamyites, etc. So radical culture, if you like, more generally, does tend to be about the isms and the ites. And I should just say, going back to Biagini, a great book in many ways, Liberty, Retrenchment, Reform, I would recommend it to everybody, fascinating volume. One of the things he says, though, is that all those big crusades around the Polish Rising, in support of the North during the American Civil War, in support of Italian unification, they all bring a new generation of radical politicians into the fold, particularly in Britain. Well, I'm here to tell you it ain't so, actually, because people like George Odker, people like Howell, for example, people like Lucraft, they all had Chartist antecedents. So this isn't a new tradition. It's a tradition that actually draws on some very old ideas. And whilst I think the liberal continuity argument is very interesting and says a lot about the shape of politics in the 1850s, 1860s, I think it's particularly good for programs. It's good for electioneering, it's good for elections in general, it's good for programmatic radicalism. It's not so good for radical culture. It doesn't fit radical culture. And I think that's where some of the deficiencies lie. And these are the points I want to develop for the rest of the talk. So a collection of isms, a heterodox tradition. If I were to try and pin down the 19th century radical tradition, I would describe it just completely off the top of my head and in no particular order as a collection roughly of the following. Mutualists, in Britain and the US actually, mutualists, former free soilers, old anti-slavery campaigners, 8-hour day enthusiasts, currency campaigners, opponents of private banknotes, proto-greenback Labourites, former Owenites, secularists, O'Brienites, Locofocos, Republicans, Josiah Warrenites, free lovers, which isn't what you think it is about at all. It's about something completely different. Spiritualists, faddists of all stripes, and enthusiasts for international languages. Now, actually, female suffragists do unfortunately get lumped in with this, and it's very unfortunate, I think, that Marx took this view. I do just want to say something about international languages, because I have become a bit unhealthily obsessed with international languages, and it does occur to me, if we had an international language, then the conference proceedings would be much easier. And I'm not talking about Esperanto, because that's late in the day. That's a new kid on the block as far as international languages are concerned. I'm talking about the marvelously entitled Universal Glot from 1868, which was invented by a man called Jean Pirot. And the section 12 of the New York IWMA partly fell into favour because they championed Universal Glot by Jean Pirot. There are a number of others. There's also Volapük, about which I know nothing at all. And there was also Abarn, which is an international language which seems to have been confined exclusively to West Yorkshire in the UK. So I know very little about that at all. But these are the kinds of ideas, roughly, that circulated very, very widely within radicalism. And of course, how do you move it on? Spiritualism as well. Good, thank you. I'll come on to Bronte O'Brien in a few moments, but just thinking about the radical tradition more generally, Gareth Stedman Jones yesterday asked about 1848. And the fact is, if you read something like the International Herald, it's absolutely saturated with ideas about 1848. It goes back to it again and again and again. And 1848 is obviously a key point of origin for the First International. People locate themselves in regard to it. But the radical tradition is so broad that everybody can have their own interpretation of 1848. And actually, if you are, of course, a socialist or a Marxist, it's a great moment of international liberty and rebellion and revolutionary fervour. If you're a spiritualist, it's about the explosion of spiritual energies into the everyday world. It's about the Rochester rappings. It's about the Fox sisters. It's about the beginning of the clairvoyance movement. If you're a feminist, if you're a suffragist, it's actually about Seneca Falls. It's about the first convention, really, of women reformers in the United States of America. So again, what you have with a lot of these ideas, a lot of this background, is a set of contexts people can locate themselves in. No one of these contexts is unique. Before I get on to the O'Brienites, I should just say that out of my list, I left Tory radicals, which is unforgivable of me, actually, because one of the unfortunate tendencies of Marx was to actually rather like Tory radicals. And some of you will know that he was something of an enthusiast for David Urquhart, actually. Not only that, but probably the most sinister eminence grise, of course, in the First International is the truly appalling Maltman Barry, who is responsible for sort of bringing it to its knees at the very end. And there is no doubt he was a Tory radical. So it's an unfortunate tendency of Marx that of all the various traditions, this is the one he seems to favour. He doesn't like the O'Brienites, of course, followers of Bronte O'Brien. You can see what he said about them. Full of follies and crotchets, such as currency quackery, false emancipation of women and the like. In spite of their follies, they're kind of useful because they're a counterweight to the trades unionists on the council. They're more revolutionary, they're firmer on the land question, they're not susceptible to bourgeois bribery. So he tolerated them. He didn't have a lot of time for them, though, unfortunately. Which is unfortunate, because the O'Brienites are one of the key elements, really, throughout the history of the First International in the UK. They're there in 1862, of course, really that famous occasion when the French representatives come over and talk about internationalism. They're there at the very end. Some of the meetings of the International are held in their headquarters, the Eclectic Institute, and William Harrison Riley, who is the editor of the International Herald, which is the journal, really, of the First International in the UK, was an O'Brienite. And if you read the International Herald, running in those final dark months of the existence of the International, you'll see there's very little about windy declarations of internationalism at all. It's all about spiritualism. It's about spiritualism becoming a part of the academy, should be taught really at universities and at school. It's about the colonisation of Mars. the red planets. I suppose that's appropriate. It's about going back to the land. It's about allotment schemes. It's not really about the things that we associate with the international. Yet this is the journal of the IWMA in Britain. Woodhull and Clayfin's journal in New York is as bad, quite frankly. It's full of stuff about spiritualism. Woodhull was a clairvoyant. She's obsessed with some of these issues. In the dying days of the international, it's really something like spiritualism that's coming very, very strongly to the fore, I think. And this is something, obviously, we can talk about. So where does this all leave us? I do have 5 minutes. I have a mood picture of spiritualism, just in case you're interested. This is where you can buy your own Ouija board. The only reason why I've put this up is because it's from the back of a free thought pamphlet. So again, if you're talking about a heterodox tradition, an American free thought pamphlet, here you have free thought, here you have spiritualism. They seem to be quite happy to rub shoulders together in the same published material. So what else really about radicalism both in New York and in London? Are there any overlaps? Well, I would say there's one big overlap. There's obviously the urban context of the IWMA, not just the urban context, but the metropolitan context of the IWMA. The fact is that although at the very beginning of the conference there was some talk about it'd be nice to identify IWMA supporting farm workers and labourers, we haven't found very many. And that's because I don't think the IWMA ever put down very significant roots really in the countryside. It's an urban movement, and because it's an urban movement, it draws on all the traditions I've outlined. It prospers particularly in places that have very fluid crowd politics, that have congregations really of refugees, that have groups of people who are excluded, that have weak political parties, places like New York, places like London, places that don't have citywide non-corrupt governments, so there's no platform for conventional reformers. It prospers in places that are banking centres. New York, London, that's why so many of them are currency reformers. That's why the O'Brienites want to colonise the IWMA in the way that they do. Just to give you another mood picture, this is a Republican meeting in Trafalgar Square in 1872. You'll probably recognise the scenario. You may recognise the Landseer Lions, dark picture, threatening picture. This is the phantasmagoria of the First International. It's going to drag you all down and you're next. And if you look at the front, you'll see a bit of an example of radical chic there. You'll see the marvellous side whiskers, the little glasses. These are clearly émigré radicals, actually, if you like, in their environment, causing trouble. Tompkins Square, 1874, you mentioned that again. Here's another demonstration. So we're dealing with something that's definitely metropolitan, not just urban, but metropolitan. And the fact is that when the First International collapses, when it implodes in London in 1872, the provincial branches cannot survive. The branch in Manchester collapses, the branch in Nottingham collapses soon afterwards, and what you end up with is a kind of reverse image of 19th century British radicalism. Not the image of a strong provincial regional radicalism and a weak centre, but actually a weak centre, an active centre that's the place where these radicals flourish, and weak regional centres where radicalism has gone into decline. Similar picture in the US maybe. New York is a strong radical heartland, but the IWMA limping on barely in places like Philadelphia and Boston thereafter. So we are dealing with something that is remorselessly metropolitan, and there's no getting away from that. I did just want to say something a little bit about the organisation. I've only got 3 minutes. The organisation of the IWMA, probably 2 now, 1 in 30 seconds. Basically, anybody who knows anything about 19th century radicalism, when you look at the context of it, when you look at the fetes, when you look at the soirees, when you look at the teas, when you look at the entertainment of visiting radicals and the visiting of dignitaries, you're seeing something that's in a very long tradition. And the fact is, Marx used to overclaim a lot about the IWMA. He used to say the IWMA was the progenitor of other radical organisations, like the Land and Labour League, like the Reform League, overclaiming. All these organisations were basically staffed by the same very small group of people who moved from club to club to club, not dissimilar in New York, of course. The Brooklyn Spread the Light Club is a later example of that. So these are radicals who colonise these different platforms. They're not necessarily great enthusiasts for the IWMA, but it's a vehicle. I'm not going to use the word front, but it is a vehicle, something that they can use for their own ends. And these are traditions that really circle around meeting places. Places like the Red Lion in Holborn, for example. These are places where radicals congregated. And things like the IWMA are a little bit of an umbrella organisation behind which people can rally. Then when it falls away, they join the Land and Labour League. So in other words, a lot of these people are not rabid internationalists. They're people who are part of a tradition of doing that in the capital. I think I do need to stop now, but just very, very briefly, finally, I do want to say something about empire. And the fact is, the IWMA was quite weak on empire. The positivists clearly weren't. The IWMA was. Maybe that's why it doesn't put down any roots in the Australian colonies, or in New York, or in New Zealand, or in the Cape Colony. Maybe that's why it has nothing very much to say about the Governor Eyre controversy, which is now seen as a really seminal moment, really, in the history of 19th century Britain. One thing people haven't talked about is legacy. Oh, not a great deal. Very, very famously, George Lansbury in Britain said, legacy of the IWMA, it was all these trades unionists like John Hales. They all grew up in the sanctity of Victorian liberalism. Not much more to say about them than that, really. I think actually the alternative international, the international that isn't the international of conventional international radicals, the international of the spiritualists and the land reformers and the people who are interested in currency reform, does have a clear legacy. It has a legacy in people like W.H. Riley, for example, editor of the International Herald, who popularises Walt Whitman in Britain, for example, and spends lots of time in the US. It has a legacy in John De Morgan, for example, a great exponent of reoccupying the common land, who goes to the US and gets involved with the populists. It has a legacy in the O'Brienites, who go off to Kansas and found an ideal colony in Kansas. And these are not the conventional legacies of the First International, but I do think they are significant. And maybe just very finally, very, very finally, maybe if we're looking for a legacy, we should be going back to someone like Stephen Yeo, The Religion of Socialism, very, very famous article from 1977 in History Workshop Journal, where he talks about the fact that these alternative traditions are the seedbed, if you like, of the socialist revival of the 1880s and 1890s, not just in Britain, but in the US and elsewhere. And I'll end it on that note.